that recording?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Just go speak.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Perfect. Okay. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodianship of the country on which the University of campus stands. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. All right, just to provide a little bit of an overview about what we're going to be talking about today. As the start of the talk, I'll be talking first and then I'll pass over to Chris. I'll be talking a little bit about a study we conducted in 2005, looking at the harms experienced by family members. And I'll be providing a general introduction to our approach that we've developed or Fighting Angels developed at the university. And it's divided into 3 sections. I'll be talking about the first section, which is psychoeducation about gambling. Then Chris will be talking about harm minimisation and setting limits and managing the relationship, and also places to get more help. So other things that the gambler, other support services that the family member may find useful. Okay, so now I know most of you are very familiar with what we do here, and a lot of you come to journal clubs quite frequently, but there are a few people that we know coming today that don't have necessarily a history or good background to the university clinic. We were established in 1999, so we've been around for a long time. We've been continuously funded by the Responsible Gambling Fund. We started off as just one counsellor, which was Fadi, in one room over in Batham. And over the years, we've expanded to locations in Camperdown, Lidcombe, Parramatta and Campbelltown. And we've provided support to over 8,000 gamblers and significant others in that time. Okay, so in terms of treatment of family members at the GTRC, last year we saw 61 new family clients over that year. So it's less than 5% of the total number that we see in any one year. We generally get about 1 referral a week. So it's a small but significant portion of the clients that we see. About half, and I'm sure this is probably the same for most of the other services, are the partner of the gambler, and the remainder are usually other family members, parents, children, siblings and friends. In terms of, I don't have exact figures for this, but from my own personal experience, I tend to see probably around half of the family members, the gambler is actually already in treatment with us, and around the other half, they're not. And they're actually often coming to actually talk about how to get their family member into treatment. On average, and this has been consistent over the years, we usually see family members for about 2 to 3 appointments. We also offer couples counselling. This is varied over the years. We used to have 2 counsellors, including myself and one other who was trained in emotion-focused therapy for the treatment of relationship issues. So that's a much longer treatment that we provide sort of indefinitely depending on availability. But at the moment, we haven't been providing that because I've come back from maternity leave and we're trying to sort of focus on treating the gamblers that are coming in. But we do offer couples counselling. We were going to talk about that today, but we realised that we really didn't have time because that's a whole other topic. So back in 2016, because we also conduct research here, we conducted a study looking at the harms experienced by gamblers and family members, and that included 205 significant others. And again, the figures were very, very similar. So this was a population survey. Were very similar to what we saw in terms of demographics. The demographics are very similar to in treatment. So about 60% were female, half were spouses, and the rest you can see there. I'm trying to remember now who the others were, because there's 7% of them. I'm figuring maybe that's employers. I don't know. Brittany and Dylan know. You were part of that survey. I'm not sure why 7% are other categories. I'm not sure who they are. When you look at the harms that they were reporting in that study, they tend to fall within 3 broad categories. There's financial harms, physical health harms and psychological harms. The physical harms tend to be things like partners' lack of sleep because they're worried when the gambler goes out, poor diet and exercise and things like that, because generally it causes quite a lot of stress. Probably the most consistent problems that family members report are financial issues. And I'm sure this is pretty familiar to all of you. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations where they're like, you know, now I realise there's a gambling problem. Looking back, my partner never had any money when we first met. We never really went anywhere or did anything. I found myself paying for a lot of things. So it's often the first thing that they start to notice as a little bit amiss. And it's often the first thing or the thing that actually gets them into treatment. So usually the partner has discovered some sort of major financial issue, be that, you know, credit cards that they didn't know about, perhaps they were saving for a mortgage and then they realised that the savings were gone, or for a wedding or something like that. So I'm sure those stories are pretty familiar to all of you. What we also see really commonly are feelings of shame, loneliness and embarrassment. I find very typically they often haven't told anybody. They often don't tell other people because they're embarrassed themselves, and sometimes it's because they're protecting the family member, their partner or the gambler from the judgment of family and friends. You know, typically they might say things like, I couldn't tell my parents about it because they've never forgiven my partner. And so as a result of that, they feel incredibly isolated and alone. And often we're actually the first person that they've been able to talk to. Those feelings of shame, loneliness, embarrassment can also lead to more severe symptoms, anxiety, depression, and suicidality is also not uncommon. I had a piece of paper that had some, I don't know that I actually brought it with me, that had some quotes from the study around the typical things that family members report. Doesn't matter. In terms of the approach that we take at the university, just to give you a little bit of background, the manualised approach that we developed, I'm not an expert now, thank you, was in part developed because we started an intern program. Was it 2012 we started an intern program? I can't remember, it was a few years ago now. And we have a really structured program for the gambler. Not as structured, we didn't have a clear guideline for how to deal with family members, and a lot of the interns were like, I'm not really sure what I'm meant to do when a family member's in front of me. And typically they will have to see family members. So we set about coming up with a semi-structured manual that would address some of the concerns that family members come in with. It's more semi-structured, so it's less structured than our manuals for the problem gamblers, in part an acknowledgement of the diversity of issues that family members come in with, the differing relationships, sometimes they're grandparents, children, partners, so that can change the issues that they come in to talk about. And so what we wanted to do was, I guess, given the fact that they only come in 2 to 3 sessions in general, how can we structure those sessions to make them as valuable as possible for the family members that come in? So in order to do that, as a starting point, what we wanted to look at were what are the typical questions that they actually come in with. And you will see that they fall, I guess, into 3 broad categories. The first one is just getting information, so psychoeducation. They, as the first part, often are absolutely dumbfounded as to why and how the gambler can have spent all their money. They typically often don't gamble themselves, so it's very mystifying as to how the problem started and why it's continuing. They're also really keen to understand how to get them into therapy, and they're also often have no idea what therapy entails, and they have never been to therapy before, and they certainly don't understand what therapy for gambling would look like. The second broad category focuses on the finance part, because remember, often that's what's actually got them in there. They've realised that they're either in large amounts of debt that they were unaware of. There may be children involved. They may be bleeding money at that stage, and they're like, how do I protect myself? How do I protect potentially my children? And how do I make sure that we don't end up losing our home or not being able to pay the rent, things like that. So financial strategies, understanding what their legal rights are and how to manage finances and things like that is really important. Just how to protect themselves is a big topic that they want to address. The third topic that they usually want to discuss is the relationship issues. You know, often the gambler's been gambling for a long time and the relationship has deteriorated over time. There's usually lots of conflicts, lots of arguments, difficulty communicating with one another, and also disintegration of trust, and also not really understanding how to manage themselves within that as well. So they're the broad topics. In terms of the method, as we said, it's more semi-structured. It's much less directive than what we do with the problem gambler. And we focus on, I guess, Socratic questioning. We're really about asking the right questions to understand what the family members' concerns are and not giving them answers. You know, we're not here to tell them whether they should leave or stay. It's not our job. We're here to help them get some more clarity and to understand more about how they're feeling and what they want to do, and maybe talk about what their priorities are. Having said that, there are often some very clear misconceptions that they're coming in with that are really unhelpful. Things like believing that it's their fault, that they're the cause of the gambling, not believing that therapy will be helpful, even things like believing that GA is a treatment rather than a support group. So there are some misconceptions that I think are really useful to discuss. But we try and make it as flexible as possible, and we just focus on the areas that the family member wants to discuss. We're not directing it. It's very much about the family member leads the discussions, and we're trying to empower them as much as we can to discuss specific issues directly with the gambler. Okay, so the first topic is usually psychoeducation. So how did the gambling problem develop? As I said, they're often completely bewildered and confused as to how the gambler can be finding it so difficult to stop or to control. And again, I don't want to get into a contentious debate. For us, we focus a lot on emphasising the importance of these early experiences. So gamblers typically, well, in fact, I think all of the gamblers that come through the clinic have had a positive early experience with gambling that encourages further gambling and lays down a pathway that encourages more gambling in the future. The gambler becomes more focused on being up in a session and sort of seeing patterns and developing beliefs about gambling. And they also typically, obviously, because of the way that gambling is structured, will lose money. Almost certainly they're losing money or they wouldn't be here, and they get trapped in a cycle of trying to repay their debts. The reason we focus on these early experiences is to help them understand that from our perspective, it's not a sign of deep psychopathology. It is something where we believe under the right circumstances and conditions, almost anyone could develop a problem with gambling. So it's quite destigmatising in that way. Having said that, the responsibility with change is still with the gambler, not with the family member. And it's also to help them understand and build some hopefulness that change is actually possible. And one way of underscoring this is to kind of do the counterfactual. So for instance, if for that gambler had the first 10 times they gambled had lost their money each time, how likely is it that they'd continue to gamble? Well, pretty unlikely. And often the family member can relate to that because that's been their experience, and that's why they have a negative attitude towards gambling rather than a positive one. Okay, this is probably the most contentious slide. Is gambling an addiction? And that's often what family members come in discussing. We know how we view problem gambling. We're not here to tell anyone else what they should think about it. There is debate about whether it's an addiction. From our perspective, even if forget about the evidence that it's not an addiction, there are some practical reasons for kind of, I guess, challenging that idea a little bit, because the idea of an addiction does reduce the gambler's agency over their own behaviour. And so what we tend to do is give a very sort of brief, I guess, comparison with drugs and alcohol. So typically with drugs and alcohol, the typical features or the things that tend to mark out or that do mark out an addiction to substance use is loss of control, tolerance, and withdrawal. So with the gambling, with drug addiction, tolerance is I need to take more and more of the drug to get the same effect. while gamblers do increase their spending, what you find under closer examination is that increase in spending has actually more to do with chasing losses. Also, in terms of withdrawal, when people experiencing substance use, the physiological withdrawal can be so intense and so difficult that people can actually die from physiological withdrawal from drugs. We don't see that with gambling. In fact, when gamblers aren't able to gamble, like they go on holiday to Fiji or somewhere else, what they'll typically say, invariably actually, is, I didn't think about it. I didn't have access to it. I didn't think about it. Now, if you had someone who was addicted to drugs, it doesn't matter where you take them, they're going to have the withdrawal symptoms. That doesn't happen with with gambling. And often as well, when they don't have access, like absolutely know where they can go to get money, they also feel relief, rather than I must gamble even though I can't. Loss of control is another area, and one of the things I always ask them is, have there been any times where the gambler brought home winnings? And invariably will say yes, which means that the gambler does have control over their gambling, and that at times they have actually chosen to walk away. So again, we're trying to emphasise that it is the gambler's responsibility to change, without stigmatising the gambler, but also giving the family member that message. So we're emphasising their responsibility for their actions. Another really common issue is, am I to blame? Family members often take responsibility and feel very much that it's their fault that the gambler is gambling. Why does that occur? Well, sometimes the gambler actually tells them it's their fault. And there's often been a deterioration in the relationship, and they believe that the gambler is gambling because of, we argue too much, you know, my partner is depressed about the relationship, they're stressed because of the problems we're having, and that's what's leading them to gamble. Now, I would argue that lots of family members, or lots of families and couples are under stress, have high degrees of conflict, and partners can be depressed in the relationship, but they don't select gambling as an activity. That's a different question. Why they select gambling as activity, if you think about it, it's a logical deduction. That can't be the family member's fault. So even though stress, low mood might contribute to the problem, it doesn't explain why they've picked gambling. So it can't be the family member's fault, is a simple answer. You can also ask them questions like, has the gambler ever gambled when the relationship's been good? Invariably, yes. Has the gambler ever gambled when they haven't been stressed? Yeah. So again, it's about asking the right questions and helping the family member to see that it's not their fault, and to try and help them to move towards active problem solving rather than self-blame. Next big question is, can they stop? And again, when you've got a family member coming in where maybe their children, they've lost all their money, they may be thinking about whether to stay or to go, this is a really important question that they're trying to grapple with. What we focus on is that for most gamblers that come to our clinic that finish treatment, they are most likely to cut down or stop, significantly cut down or stop gambling. Having said that, there are no guarantees. That doesn't always happen. And we also try and get them to a realistic view of what that change will look like. When they first come in, we're trying to essentially create an alternative pathway in terms of the gambling. We're trying to create an attitude towards gambling where they become less interested and disinterested in gambling. Now, that can take time. They've been gambling, they've been going over this old pathway for many, many, many years, and developing an alternative pathway with alternative neural pathways. Those neurons that are firing on the old pathway will take a while to deactivate, and we have to keep going over the new pathway, keep teaching them about their gambling, keep helping them to understand why they gamble so that they can create a new alternative pathway, and that can take time. And it's also why we emphasise completing treatment. The other interesting research observation is that so many gamblers actually spontaneously get better. And so even without treatment, there's hope. And so again, it kind of belies this idea that gamblers have no control. In fact, there was a study by Williams done in 2005 that looked at 4,000 non-gamblers, recreational gamblers, and problem gamblers. And actually the vast majority of problem gamblers had a problem for only 12 months and then they stopped on their own accord. So there's a lot of reason to believe that if they come in for treatment as well, that those outcomes will be good. And we're trying to build that hopefulness that change is possible. Okay, last bit. How do we talk to them and get them into therapy? So again, we're trying to empower the gambler to have the tools and the confidence to talk effectively with the gambler. So we're focusing on them being calm but assertive. And Chris is going to talk in his section on how to help clients with assertiveness skills and communication skills. It's really important to focus on planned discussions, not when they're arguing and highly emotional. It's not the best time to be talking about going in for treatment. Try and focus on non-blaming, using lots of I statements rather than "you've done this to us." And because the gambler's already experiencing high levels of shame, which is just going to make them want to avoid the topic even more. We focus on, I guess, talk to the partner about the impact it's had on the family member and how they can communicate that to the gambler. And then we try and balance that with some hopefulness about treatment. So most of these conversations tend to happen with the gambler coming up with a range of reasons why they don't want to attend. Lots of barriers. Therapy doesn't work. Why would talking to someone help me? And that's where we talk about treatment outcomes. We talk about the fact that we've been open for 20 years. This is all we do. We're very experienced at dealing with this problem. Second barrier might be things like, well, I've been to therapy before and it doesn't work. And again, it's about letting them know that there's lots of different approaches to therapy, not only that, but people can come to treatment it can take them more than one attempt to get better. It's arming them with that information. Another barrier for them to come in is just the shame. And I guess emphasising for us, we help the family member to see that because we are just focused on treating problem gambling, this is all we do, it's completely normalised. You know, we understand what they're going through. We're here to help, not to judge. They're also often generally feeling really uncertain. They don't understand what therapy is, how long it will take, what it will look like. And so helping the family member to understand what therapy looks like, how many sessions the core part of the treatment lasts for, you know, how many, if they're going to come in weekly, how long the sessions are and things like that, that it's free, and that they're also not going to be necessarily that it's up to them to determine their goals, even though ultimately we don't see any point in the gambling. And often people will come in with an idea that they want to control their gambling and then move to an abstinence goal down the track. Often that's a big barrier to a gambler coming in because they don't necessarily want to stop at this stage. And knowing that when they come in, the focus is going to be on working with them and what their goals are is another way of reducing the barriers for the family member coming in. That's all I want to say.
Okay, what I'm going to start with is talking about harm minimization and setting limits. And what we're really focusing on here is, I guess, general answers to the question of how can the family member protect themselves? Like, obviously, a lot of that focus is going to be on financially, but also how they can protect themselves psychologically and in some cases physically. So one of the most common questions we get asked is, should I give the gambler money? I don't know if other gambling counselors get that one all the time. Yeah. And even though from our perspective, the answer is generally no, we try and sort of guide people as to how to sort of come to that answer on themselves. We don't usually will say to them straight out no. It's more sort of through sort of questioning, probing, sort of weighing up the pros and cons, basically getting people to that answer. So there might be specific circumstances under which we might suggest that people give gamblers money, but usually that's only in situations where the consequences would be extremely severe. So that might be if the gambler owes money to a loan shark, a drug dealer, something like that, where the consequences might be, you know, for both the gambler and their family quite shocking. Or if there's like an immediate risk that they might be like the gambler and their family might be homeless in the case of a parent, debating whether to help them out with a mortgage or something like that. But essentially what we want the family member to consider is, firstly, what is the cost to them if they financially help? Do they actually have the money to help? Like, for example, I had a case where she was the mother of a problem gambler, and she herself was, she was turning 60 recently. She didn't have much money in superannuation. So all the cash that she did have was in savings. Should she give essentially all the money that she had to her son who was a gambler, knowing that that was essentially all the money that she had for her retirement? So it's about helping them assess their own capacity to help, and also asking them the question, well, you know, if you are constantly bailing out the gambler, what motivation are they going to have to stop? So it's not basically saying, yeah, if you give them the money, they're never going to stop, but basically encourage them to think about, well, what is likely to be the consequence on the gambling behavior if you're continually giving them money? So the specific points that we want to raise in this discussion is, generally speaking, if you're giving your clients small to medium amounts of cash, the likelihood that they're going to gamble it is extremely high. So generally speaking, if you are going to help financially, don't give them cash. Most of the time, if someone has money for a specific need, whether it's to pay school fees or to help out with their mortgage, or because they can't buy food for their family, we generally recommend that these are paid directly to a financial institution or the relevant body, rather than just giving them the cash directly, because it just raises that likelihood that that money is to be spent gambling. But one thing that we do sort of emphasize is the importance of having some sort of, doesn't have to be a formal agreement in a legal sense, but at least some sort of plan for, if I'm going to give you this money, how is it going to be repaid? So helping them set up sort of a realistic payment plan with the gambler, so that it's not that they're being bailed out with sort of free money, so to speak. But, you know, if it's a parent saying to a gambler, well, fine, I can give you 10 grand to help you cover your mortgage that you're sort of in arrears for, or your rent, or whatever the case may be, but you agree to pay me back X amount per month, as opposed to, I'm just going to give you this money. So that, yeah, coming back to that, you know, what harm could come to the family if the money isn't given, which I guess what I was speaking about earlier. We don't want to sort of advocate like a complete sort of tough love. You know, if the gambler gambles, too bad, they're out on their street, their kids can starve. You know, that's not your problem, because one, it's not realistic to say to parents, children, spouses of gamblers to take that approach. And also it's not necessarily going to be beneficial for the gambler if they're being placed in a situation where they do have these extreme levels of stress. I don't know, do anyone else have any thoughts on that particular question that's sort of different to that or around that, or no? No? Okay.
What if it's been a continual situation where
Yeah.
you bail them out heaps of times, and they just keep finding themselves back there?
Yeah, and I think that definitely comes back to the formal agreement part. So it's not just about giving money as they need it, but it's about putting things in place. So if I give you this money this time, that's it. So usually, often when a family member comes in, it's because a common story that I've heard from parents is that they've bailed out their child once, and the child says, I'm never going to do it again. And it's usually then the parents come in when the second time comes up. So it's about sort of putting out, well, you know, perhaps you know, putting in these formal agreements in place so they know that this is it, it's not coming again. Detailing what sort of support you can give them. So as I said, you know, they don't want, obviously, their grandkids to be homeless. So it's about putting things in place so that people are well supported. And I think that's one of the sort of general principles, is that if there is to be impacts of the gambling financially on someone, that it is on the gambler. It's not on their children. It's not going to be on, you know, their spouse. That you try and make sure that if there is impact, that it is on the gambler themselves. And so try and support the other people in the household as best you can, but without, you know, constantly giving that the money.
What in the case where you have
Yep. So yeah, we're going to get to that. We'll get to that one later. Okay. One of the other questions occasionally that comes up, not very often, but it's sort of like, should I give money for controlled gambling? Like, is it appropriate that I'll take control over the finances, but I'll give the gambler $100 a week or $200 a week so they can have their outlet? One of the things that we emphasize, and this comes back to, I guess, what Kirsten was discussing earlier, is the thing is about gambling is like there is no biological need for gambling. A gambler is not going to go into withdrawal symptoms and go into a coma or have a seizure because they can't gamble. But there's not, if they're saying, oh, but they're stressed, they need to have gambling as their outlet. It's about sort of emphasizing, well, ultimately it's their choice if that's how you choose to arrange your finances. However, there's not really any evidence to suggest that gamblers have a need to gamble, that somehow if they're not gambling, it's going to cause all these problems in their life. And a lot of the stress that they are experiencing is because of their gambling, as opposed to being relieved by their gambling. So that is one that we would sort of, I guess one of those examples that Kirsten said before, where there might be clear misconceptions that we're trying to rectify. Now, should I take control over the finances? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because on one hand, what we generally find is if the spouse or some other family member takes control over the finances and the gambler has no access to money, then yes, they are going to stop gambling. But in what sense is the gambling problem actually being addressed? So quite often in these cases, the family member will take control over the finances. The gambler is given like an allowance or pocket money, so to speak, which I guess comes to your earlier point of it's almost like the spouse then becomes the parent who sort of takes control over the finances. And the gambler is only given this small amount that they have to, buy petrol with or buy bus tickets or whatever the case may be. This is something generally that we actually don't advocate for. It might be sort of a useful stopgap for like a week or two. But the reason why we don't advocate for it is because essentially the gambler needs to learn how to have access to money and not gamble. Because otherwise you can never really say that, treatment has been effective if basically they just don't have any chance to gamble. So part of that discussion is going to be, well, if you are going to take control over the finances for a period, is there going to be a discussion about when that turnover is going to be lifted and what it's going to look like when it's lifted? When I get to the section on trust, one of the things that we do advocate that the partner or the parent or whoever the case may be does have access to the gambler's fund and is able to see what they're doing. So we advocate for transparency, but not necessarily for control over finances. And also this touches into a sort of issue that sometimes is not thought about, is if the family member is taking complete control over the finances, there's also a risk for financial abuse to occur, where it's almost like then the gambler becomes punished in a sense for their previous gambling behavior by sort of punitive behavior from the family member that's taking control over their finances. So it's not something that commonly happens, but it is a risk that we do need to think about. So, if there is, say, a husband that discovers that, or even a wife that discovers that their partner has been gambling, takes control over their finances, and from that period, then becomes, I'm only going to give you money if it's something that I approve of, who says you need new shoes, who says you need new work clothes. There is this potential that it could slip into this quite financially abusive pattern. And also with, if children want to take care of their adult parents' finances, particularly if their adult parents are elderly, then that can also create a risk of elder abuse as well. So we do have to be very careful. I know it sounds straightforward that yes, this is a great idea for protecting yourself is to take control over the finances, but there are a lot of I guess, disadvantages of that sort of arrangement that aren't necessarily readily apparent to the person that's coming in to seek treatment. How can I force them to stop? Now, this is one of the hardest questions to answer because but this is a question where I will be quite blunt with people, and I will go through a lot of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, ways of communicating effectively, ways of encouraging gamblers to seek treatment, ways of supporting gamblers through treatment. But ultimately, we do have to emphasize that the gambler, if they choose to continue gambling, that is their choice. And as horrible as that can be to say to some families sometimes that have been through horrible things because of their partner's gambling, ultimately we, the family member, no one can force someone to stop gambling. You know, I know there's probably going to be a range of opinions as to whether or not that's fair or that's right, or whether we should be able to self-exclude third parties from casinos and clubs and whatnot. But unfortunately, as the law is now, we can't ever force someone to stop gambling. So we can talk about self-exclusion programs, but we do have to emphasize that they are voluntary in nature. And as counsellors, like I know most counsellors would have access to the multi-venue self-exclusion program, is that one of the conditions of using it is that you're not supposed to put someone through the program if you do suspect that they are being coerced to go through the program. So the question then moves on to then, well, what if they don't stop? And so that's the question that I will ask partners or parents or children is, well, you know, ultimately, yes, there are reasons to be hopeful. There are reasons to think that if they do engage in treatment, that they will, you know, be able to reduce their gambling. But what if they don't stop? So what is that about? It's about encouraging the spouse or the parent to think about protecting themselves. So yes, we wouldn't encourage a spouse to take control over a gambler's finances, but we would say to them, make sure your own finances are in order. Make sure you have control over your own finances. And perhaps, you know, I had a wife of a problem gambler come in and she said, oh yeah, he's disclosed he's got a gambling problem. He suggested to me that if we combine our super in a self-managed super fund, it's going to help him recover some of the money that he's lost. I couldn't say blank out that's a terrible idea, but I did sort of encourage her to think that maybe that's not such a good idea, because it's about ensuring that people are protected themselves. If the gambler does choose to go on gambling because we can't force them to stop, how are you going to protect yourself? Okay, so this is also, we need to think about domestic violence as an issue. We do need to assess the level of you know, pre-existing violence or coercion that may be going on within a relationship, to also think about how clients may protect themselves from violence as well. So this is a very complicated issue, and probably, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into it in the detail it does deserve, but we never sort of assume that that a partner is going to be safe from domestic violence. We do need to always assess this, discuss what's going on in the household, discuss what's going on with the children, because we don't want to give any advice that might be putting someone at risk for experiencing harm or violence. All right. Any questions about harm minimization stuff before we move on to the final section, or thoughts or comments, or no? Yeah. 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 Yeah, definitely. And so we do, yeah, there obviously is a reluctance because people don't want, even sometimes the victims of domestic violence don't want it sort of to cause issues for the perpetrator. And so it can be a very difficult conversation, but it's about working as a clinician to make sure this is my client, this is the person who's in front of me. How can I do the best to make sure they're safe and to encourage them to do what's best for their own safety, which is not always going to be, sometimes that's going to be clear cut and sometimes it's not. So yeah, so we do encourage gambling services to know your local police officers and to know what domestic violence services are available in your area, what shelters are available in your area, so that if you do need to access those resources, you can do so immediately. It's not something where you have to say, oh, I'll get back to you in a few days. I just need to look at this and look at that. It's best to sort of have that on hand from the start, because these things aren't going to come up every day. But when they do come up, it's best to be able to address it as quickly as you can. So managing the relationship. So most of the stuff that we spoke about before, that tends to be the stuff that the family members will want addressed in the first time they come see you. So the first time they come see you, they want to know the psychoeducation, they want to know about gambling, they want to know about what I should do. This sort of stuff about managing the relationship, it tends to be what we sort of work on in the later sessions. And the other thing that we try and emphasize here is we try to give family members the best skills that they can get for working on improving their relationship, but also emphasize that even if you are behaving perfectly skillful, that's not necessarily in and of itself going to change the gambler's behavior or the way that they're interacting with you. So it's about giving them the best chance they have, but making sure that their expectations are realistic. So when can I trust them again? That's another big question. I don't know, pretty much most spouses are going to come in with that question or ask it at some point. So as I said before, the thing that we sort of almost insist on is that openness when it comes to finances. That the gambler has to agree that all finances are open. It's not necessarily that, as I said, the staff is in control of it, but they can see all your bank accounts, they can see all your credit card statements. We almost also suggest that family members sit down and say, well, almost like have an amnesty, like, I'm not going to get upset with you, but I need you to tell me, are there any debts that I don't know about? Are there any credit cards that I don't know about? So that it is all out on the table. And also working with the problem, the family member to say, well, if they do come up with this, oh, by the way, you know, I have $100 grand personal loan that you didn't know about, you know, you do have to stay true to your word that if you said that you weren't going to get upset about it, that you can't get upset about it, which can be a big thing. But it's about, you know, putting that on the table. So from now on, it's all clear, it's all out there. And we even go to the stage of encouraging clients to access beta reports. Do most people know what they are? Or, yeah. So it's basic. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So it's basically it's a report. It's basically like a credit report that shows people's credit scores and sort of a history of the times where they've tried to access finance. So if both parties agree to that, then it's another way of ensuring transparency, at least in terms of the finances. We also encourage the gambler to be open about urges and slip ups. So we do talk to the family member about there's a difference between a lapse and a relapse. Just because someone, you know, let's say someone was a horse race gambler where they were spending thousands of dollars a week, and then at a work function, maybe they had a bit too much to drink. They put $50 on a horse, but then sort of, you know, freaked out and said, no, I don't want to do this anymore. That doesn't mean that they're back at the space they were, and they have to be able to, they have to feel comfortable in being able to speak to you about that and not feel that they're going to be penalized for coming to you for when they have had these lapses, or even when they have an urge. Like we go through this idea that even if someone is going through treatment and they're going through treatment successfully, they are still going to have thoughts of gambling. They're not going to evaporate straight away. And so we encourage the spouse or the parent, child, whatever family member, to be open to the fact that we want the gambler to come to you when they have an urge to gamble, that they can discuss it with you rather than wait to deal with the consequences when it comes up. So it's about, I guess, encouraging the family member to say, look, I want you to come to me when you're feeling this way, and to not act in a punitive way when they do. This is one of those questions where under no circumstance probably you should give a clear answer to, even if you are 100% almost screaming in your head, yes, you should leave this person. I don't know, has anyone had cases where you just think, oh my God, just leave them? Yeah. I had a case once where it was a young woman who was on DSP and in Department of Housing. She had met a partner he was an immigrant who encouraged her to marry him very early on after they'd only known each other for a few months. They hadn't consummated their relationship since they got married. He was living in an apartment housing whilst working and encouraging her not to tell the Department of Housing, because obviously that would have impact on whether she would be able to continue there. He was extremely emotionally abusive and was very rarely at the house. I wanted to scream with every breath in my body, you have to kick this guy out, he's terrible, get rid of him. But obviously we can't tell people that, because what we really need to do, because obviously based on my values, I think that this is not a good relationship, but everyone has different values. And that's really what you help people explore when they're asking this question, is what is important to you? For some people, whether it's cultural values or personal values, the idea of, sticking with partners is really important to some people, less so to others. For other people, financial issues, trust issues might be core to their sense of values, but not as important to others. So really with this question, you're giving people space, but the sort of default thing that you want to turn to is, what do you value? And to what extent is this relationship meeting that need? So in terms of how to sort of help family members communicate with their partners and to clarify what they want to happen in their relationships. So all of our counsellors here, as well as being trained in gambling, are also trained in dialectical behaviour therapy, DBT. And so a lot of the work that we do on encouraging effective communication and effectiveness in relationship is taken from DBT. So the first thing that we ask people to do is to clarify their goals in a particular situation. So we divide relational goals into 3 separate areas. Objective effectiveness, which is basically getting what you want in a situation. Relationship effectiveness, which is like, how do I want my relationship to look like? How do I want the other person to feel about me? And self-respect effectiveness. How do I want to feel about myself in this situation? Now, all 3 of these are obviously important. What we tend to find with most clients is that they'll tend to habitually prioritize one over the other 2, all of which can have negative consequences. So when someone is constantly worried about, well, how is that other person going to think and feel about me? It usually means that they're meeting other people's needs while neglecting their own, which can lead to frustration and resentment, and it can lead to reductions in self-respect. If someone prioritizes their objective needs, like getting what I want all the time, then obviously that can lead to relationship suffering. So it's helping people explore, I guess, ways of balancing these different priorities within a relationship. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go to it in too much detail, but this is the basic ideas of what we do. So with objective effectiveness, essentially what we're focusing on is training people to be assertive. So the acronym that we sort of use for that, because for those of you who aren't familiar with DBT, they like a lot of acronyms, but is Dear Man. So you try and describe the situation in as neutral terms as possible, express what you're feeling and your opinions of the situation. So using that sort of I statements, like I'm feeling neglected in this relationship. I'm feeling unheard. I'm feeling that the gambling is taking up such a big space in our relationship that my needs aren't being met. And this is the important one, assert what you want. So give in very clear terms, what is it that you want to change? So it's not, I want things to be better, or it's not, I want you to be different. It's be very specific about what you want from the other person. So I want you to be more transparent with your bank accounts, or I want you to call me if you're not going to be home by 7 o'clock, or whatever the case may be. Reinforce, so basically give the person a reason to change. So if you do this for me, I'm going to be more relaxed. I'm going to be more, feel more confident in our relationship. If you do this for me, I'll do X, Y, Z that you've been asking me to do, that I've sort of been dragging my feet on. Sort of give the person a reason for the change. Stay mindful. So what we mean by that is stay focused on the goal. Don't be distracted. Often when people are having these sort of conversations, someone will say, oh, but remember like last week when you did this, or remember the other week when you did that. It's sort of, saying, well, yes, I do understand that that's a problem too, but let's focus on this issue for now. Appear confident and be prepared to negotiate. So we ask people to sort of prepare this sort of beforehand and to think about what are sort of the red lines for you, what are you prepared to negotiate on, and what are you prepared not to negotiate on. So relationship effectiveness. So when we're talking about improving and working on the relationship, it's really the main focus, the B is actually the most important one, validating. But it's the general framework is, be gentle, no attacks, no judgments, act interested in what the other person has to say, use this easy manner. But the most important thing is to validate. Show that you understand what the other person's saying, show that you're listening to them, and that you care about what matters to them and where they're coming from. And finally, self-respect effectiveness. So this is the one about taking care of yourself. So, be fair to yourself and to the other person. This is one that actually a lot of spouses have trouble with. There's no apologies for things that you don't have to apologize for. So in the context of gambling, it's sort of like, don't apologize for asking people to be more transparent with their finances if you've just found out that they've remortgaged your house. You don't have to apologize for that. You don't have to apologize, if you have done something wrong, apologize once. Don't sort of keep going, oh, I'm the worst person in the world. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. But don't apologize for things where you haven't done something wrong. Stick to your values and be truthful. Don't lie, don't exaggerate, don't be overly over the top about what you're describing. Stick to the facts as they are, because that's what's important. And if you stick to the facts, it's more likely that the other person is going to come on board with you and agree with what you're saying, and that you're going to be able to find sort of a common solution. All right, I've gone through this very quickly. Like normally when we do this in DBT, we'll have like a whole session on each of these slides. So I've done essentially like 4 sessions work in 5 minutes. So please ask questions, I guess, at this point before we move on, because I know I've gone through that very rapidly. No, okay. So where to get more help? So other services that are relevant to family members. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's really important to sort of have these on board so that you know where to go through them straight away. So there's the Wesley Legal Service that's specifically funded to help problem gamblers. That is statewide service, so that's access to everyone. It's also important, if you want to have access to other legal services that might be in your area. So us as a clinic, we've been working with building connections with Marrickville Legal Service. So, I'm sure most people in different areas have sort of those links, or if you haven't, sort of consider developing those links with services that are in your local area. Financial counselling, again, there's the Wesley credit line that's statewide, but there are specific financial counsellors in your local area that it's really important to sort of build those links with so that you can refer them to. It's much easier if you're saying to a person, oh, just call this number, they'll find someone for you, whereas you can say, oh, call this person, we know they're good, we've worked with them before, this is the name. Like, it feels much easier for the family member if you are able to sort of put that that face or that name to who they're contacting. Domestic violence support, so shelters in your area. 1-800-RESPECT is the general statewide, is it statewide or nationwide? Nationwide number for domestic violence support, but also, be in contact with local police services as well. And self-exclusion. So, you give people the information on self-exclusion, tell them that they can access. So there's pretty much all the counsellors here, they have access to the self-exclusion system. Yeah, so let them know that they can come here for it, they can go to any club for it. I generally don't necessarily advocate for hotels because they sort of can be a bit of a mixed bag. But generally speaking, clubs and other gambling services are usually going to be able to do that quite easily. All right. That's all we had time for today. So how much time is it? Oh, spot on noon. So we're on noon, but we do have this room for a little bit longer. So if anyone had any questions, we do have time for a few questions. Otherwise, you can email Kirsten or I if you had any specific questions that you wanted help with. And I will send around the slides as well for those of you that wanted them. But does anyone have any questions for Kirsten or I while we're here? No? Okay. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming. So remember the certificate of attendance. Certificates of attendance are on the front desk here, and if you can fill out those evaluation sheets, that we would really appreciate that. And to give them to either Terry or myself when you finish with those.